Hello, everybody, and welcome to This is Revolution. My name is Jean Badgelan, in for Jason Miles, and today we will be talking about Turkey and the recent Turkish elections and the surprising outcomes that at least some people have found in the somewhat inconclusive but perhaps conclusive first round of voting in the Turkish presidential elections, where current Turkish president Erdogan has come out on top, although not enough to forestall a second round of voting. So Turkey's going to go back to the polls, but it looks like the momentum is with the incumbent at the moment. But who knows what will happen, because Turkish politics is always very dynamic. And joining us today to talk about the elections is Selim Koru, who is an analyst at the Ankara-based Economic Policy Research Foundation of Turkey and a fellow at Philadelphia-based Foreign Policy Research Institute. He writes about Turkish politics at outlets such as the New York Times, or as we like to call it here, the failing New York Times, War on the Rocks, and he also has a Substack called Kültürkampf, which is a pretty thoughtful Substack discussing Turkish politics from a number of different perspectives. So I'd like to welcome Selim to the show. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Jim, thanks for having me on.
Well, I wanted to begin by asking you about the results of the first round. So, in the lead up to the first round of voting on May the 14th, uh, at least in some quarters in the foreign press, there seemed to be this idea that the momentum was with the opposition, that they might secure a victory, at least in the presidential election, that Kılıçdaroğlu, the opposition candidate, it might win. And the question was kind of posed, well, would Erdogan give up power? But it seems like that question is a moot question, because it looks like Erdogan did better than a lot of people in the Western media expected. How would you account for that?
He did better than a lot of people over here in Turkey also expected. And I think the main reason for that was the polling. The the polling, usually, there's a few polling companies that are pretty reputable here in Turkey. And, um, in previous elections, they put out polls saying that Erdogan was ahead. Um, and, it was always a sort of a catch up game. This election was different because um, the polling wasn't always positive, but a few months ahead of the election, it became more and more positive in favor. So it was in favor of Kılıçdaroğlu in the months ahead. So I think that was the main reason driving the positivity.
What do you think? What do you think accounts for that failure in polling? I mean, we've seen failures in polls in a lot of elections around the world, especially misjudging the power of some right wing populists to maintain a base of support. Uh,
I
but
think the no,
yeah, why were the polls out in Turkey's case?
I think the assumption was that a lot of the polling companies were taking that sort of the right wing bias or perhaps I should say the left wing bias of their profession into account. Because this country is not, I mean, it's not like there's this right wing wave sweeping across the country and taking over. It's not. We're not talking about the incumbent being a centrist party and then a right wing sort of wave taking it over. The incumbent, the 21-year incumbent, is a sort of far right leader, right? Um, So I think the assumption was also based on previous elections that these polling companies sort of knew what they were doing, and it's not just the companies. Actually, there were like I was reading, for example, people like Ateşilas Başsoy, who were sort of big names in the opposition space in terms of managing. These were people who had managed elections before on the local scale as well as on the national scale. Um, so real sort of seasoned politicos who were talking about this as kind of who were talking in very optimistic tones, I think. Yeah. And that's why people in the opposition space became optimistic. The international media was actually kind of weirded out, I think, in how optimistic some Turkish people were in opposition
Mm.
circles. Um, so they were a little more skeptical, and they were a little more sort of they weren't quite as sure because the sort of easy analysis in these kinds of cases is, well, the strong man, the nationalist leader, will likely win, and in this case, Erdogan is, I think, universally acknowledged as a very skilled politician. So the sort of basic analysis that a lot of people had was that he was going to win again, and then the opposition here was so enthusiastic, I think, that it was able to convert a lot of people in the international space.
Right. So there was a perception, at least amongst the opposition, you had this highly motivated opposition,
Yeah.
which you hadn't really seen in previous Turkish elections. There have been, uh, challenges to Erdogan in previous elections, and he has not always come out on top, especially in parliamentary elections. But in this election, uh, he his political parties, the parties supporting him, did pretty well in the election, and his popularity seems to have remained resilient. The X factor this time around was that you had an opposition that thought it might have a plausible chance of winning and became so enthusiastic that what you're saying is that enthusiasm basically infected a lot of the Western media core.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, and also the evidence was stacked, in the opposition's favor, in the form of polls. I think international observers like to see numbers,
Right.
especially when you're talking about, especially banks and the financial press as well. Numbers I think, are more important for the international press than they are for people here.
Yeah, so it becomes a kind of shorthand for them to be able to see where the wind is blowing in the election. So, what were you surprised about the outcome? And you know, cutting to like the serious chase is how fair were these elections? Everybody always says about Turkey. Well, Turkey's elections are free and not fair, or something like that. They'll
Yeah,
say, and people have been doing the whole thing on Twitter where it's like, well, actually, they're neither free or
yeah, yeah,
neither free or fair. But I think it's a useful shorthand for an important idea that there is some kind of at least ballot box integrity in Turkish electoral history. And of course, that's not universal, but there is a general perception that at the very core, the votes in Turkey are legit. People aren't stuffing ballot boxes. They might, be controlling the press. In some places, there might be political intimidation, even. But when the votes are cast, they they they count them up honestly. Does this result, which saw Erdogan, get about 49%, and the opposition 44, and the parliament decisively for Erdogan. what yeah uh excuse me, I lost my train of thought for a moment because it is early in the morning here. um yeah, what accounts for that?
Yeah. So, in the first part of the question, was I surprised? I think yeah. I mean, a lot of people were surprised because we had, especially towards the end, we were starting to expect, okay, all the evidence is stacked up in the opposition's favor, and that this election does appear to be different, right? Because I'm not somebody who sort of goes around, conducts his own polling, or does, you know, travels widely, and we're not really talking about very large numbers
Mm,
moving really here. I mean, if Kılıçdaroğlu plurality wasn't that far off. If maybe a couple million people had voted differently, um, across the country, then we would have seen a massive shift, and everybody would be talking, "Oh, the people have,
right.
they're finally sick of Erdogan and stuff." So it's the margins aren't all that high, and you can only tell by some sort of scientific procedure, or voting, or polling, or whatnot, and all the polling being stacked in the opposition's favor, or all the reputable polling being stacked in their favor, um, was something to be surprised about. Having said that, I did argue that it was remarkable in itself that we're still talking about only a very small part of the electorate shifting. That 45 plus percent, right? We're still going to be in favor of Erdogan after massive inflation, huge disarray with the housing market, uh, food inflation, you know, migration, significant migration for the first time in the country's modern history, right, or in recent history, right. And despite all these things that voters clearly aren't happy about, Erdogan was still getting, um, sorry, was still getting uh, robust sort of support from people, still holding on to roughly half of the country. That in itself, I think, was remarkable. And of course, the reason for that is partly to do with the second question, which is, how to think of Turkish elections in general. Are they free and fair? Are they um, unfair but free? That whole discussion. The government obviously has. Well, I say obviously now because it is obvious to people who follow Turkey. I think that the government has massive advantages. They basically have, for all intents and purposes, an unlimited budget. They have all of the apparatus of state at their disposal, and they suppress selectively the opposition at key points, right? And they sort of cripple it. I think in an essay I described it as, people will be familiar with the movie The Gladiator, where at the end in the final scene, the emperor is fighting, you know, the hero,
Maximus.
yeah, Maximus, and what the emperor does is he stabs him before the fight, conceals the wound, and then, because the emperor needs this sort of show of a fair fight, right? He needs the legitimacy of having beaten Maximus at his own game.
And in fact, that's what makes Erdogan always so effective, is that whereas another dictator might want to have a 95% electoral victory, Erdogan actually wants the appearance of this like fight, because it's part of the strategy that keeps their political movement with momentum, like that it's threatened, and that full mobilization and loyalty is uh, a requirement. So do you see this then as you know Turkey, Erdogan has this huge base of support. People still support him despite all these economic problems that you're talking about. You know, what is his appeal? Because he has genuine appeal. You know, if Erdogan wins, whatever people think about ballot box integrity, like you said, it's actually a relatively small amount of people. It's just the remarkable thing is that he has such a consolidated base. So yeah, why is he's so robust despite these ongoing problems?
Yeah, I think there's two main components to that, and the first is actually securing sort of a baseline of a standard of living,
Hmm.
right? The way people talk about elections a lot is they cite something Süleyman Demirel said, which is if if, if if the cooking pot at home is empty, the people are going to vote for change and stuff. And what people were saying before this election is that the cooking pot was empty, and that's why the electorate was shifting. Um, Now that I'm reading more and more of the sort of economists, actual economists, writing about this, it, it seems that the cooking pot wasn't empty for a lot of people, right? That Turkey was actually going through something of an employment boom since 2020, right? And that was in conjunction with, of course, the standard of living declining. So the standard of living is declining, and people's income is shrinking, and the inflation is increasing, but employment is growing in a sort of even way that across the country, right? So there was that going on. There's also if you're sort of member of the AK Party, or if you're sort of active in your neighborhood in the AK Party, they do apparently they do take care of you, right? Um, so that sort of makes sure that there is a baseline happening, that people aren't actually starving, or sort of if they're being edged out of their neighborhoods, that they find some other neighborhood, that sort of thing. And then the factor that I think is determinant is the identitarian factor. I do think that that's the engine of Erdogan's power, and that's also determines his staying power. The idea that because Erdogan has a very clear vision of a great politics. He has this imperial vision of Turkey beyond Turkey, um, of reestablishing the country's place in the sun, of geopolitical significance, of sort of restoring dignity in the way he thinks of it, restoring dignity to the nation's identity. And people are bombarded with this day in, day out, for have been for years now. Um, so that was the major thing he campaigned on. He campaigned on things like the defense sector growing. He campaigned
Hmm.
on things like his sort of stridency on the international stage. And he always established a very strong contrast with his opponents, saying, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu is going to return Turkey to being a vassal of the United States, to being a vassal of the West, whereas I will sort of uh, make sure that we are an imperial center of our own. Um,
Yeah, so he's been, and that I think that's an important distinction to make. Firstly, the point about economics. I mean, uh, what you say about the particular development of economic crisis in Turkey is fascinating. That you have employment growing, but living standards are declining. So people have jobs, which gives them a kind of sort of social capital and stability to some extent, and so they are really very much more invested in uh, in economic development, but they have jobs. And I think perhaps I don't know what you think about this, but in the grand scheme of things, over this 2 decades of Erdogan, uh, there's been a lot of deeper sort of structural changes. Massive new housing complexes. People moving from sort of shanty towns to you know what people in the West might think are ugly apartment blocks, but to people in Turkey, it's like, well, it's a house with like all the modern conveniences. Everything is functional. So there's a kind of lot of appreciation for this, a lot of resilience built out of this long-term economic transformation that is taking place. That people you know don't dismiss because of a short-term economic crisis. Do you think that plays into it to a certain degree?
Yeah, yeah. People do feel taken care of, I think, in that way. Especially, I mean, people who are sort of hooked into the Erdogan network or the AK Party network do. Um, Especially also, I think in a lot of white collar jobs today,
Hmm.
um, you actually get paid less than the sort of blue collar jobs, often in the same building. So there's a lot of talk about how sort of if you have if you're in the accounting department of some government agency or something like that, or you have this mid to low level white collar job, um, or it can also be in the private sector. The sort of that the janitorial staff, for example, is actually getting paid more than you, right? Or the person getting your tea is actually getting paid more than you because perhaps they are hooked up to the sort of the political networks that you may not be, right? So there is this sort of this sort of weird class struggle going on between uh, these segments of society where
Like
like
a downwardly mobile professional managerial elite that is just angry about being uh about losing its traditional privileged position
well, I'm not
culturally.
sure these people were very privileged to begin with, because we're talking about like 40. So I mean
So
the yeah.
more that sort of people who feel that they took a route and were kind of conned into that route, like that higher education was going to be a way to the middle class, and actually, it's not been.
Yeah. So university educated, like everywhere else, university educated people are more likely to vote for the opposition here than they are to vote for Erdogan, right? And we're talking about like roughly. Let's go with the numbers. Let's go with the recent numbers: 45 to 49% of the country, right? That 49% includes more of that sort of managing or middle level white collar class, right?
Hmm.
And then the sort of the driver there, right? Or the blue collar people working around them, right? Will are more likely to vote for Erdogan, right? And we're now at this point where that blue collar class that votes for Erdogan has more job security, is probably getting paid a little more, right? And is more comfortable. Whereas that opposition voting, but university educating class, right, is, as you said, downwardly mobile, right? They felt like they were they were doing what they were supposed to do, right? To be outwardly mobile, but instead they're moving further and further down. Like they probably didn't get that Toki house, that Toki apartment building that you were talking about. Like they probably didn't benefit from all the Erdogan programs, right? Because they weren't geared towards them. They were geared towards that blue collar uh, uh, sort of class.
Hmm. So so that's built like basically building up resentment, and
Yeah,
that's enough to have started to make these elections, at least on the surface, look relatively competitive. That there is a kind of defection of these people who may have been like AKP voters, or may have been kind of apathetic, to be more militant towards the opposition. But another aspect of what you were saying was about the kind of identitarian issues and this culture war. And I know you've written about this before, about the way that Erdogan has sort of successfully polarized the country, where you have your hierarchy with and you don't want to be out of that hierarchy, at the bottom of that hierarchy. There's a kind of drive for polarization, a kind of Carl Schmitt
mm.
influence style of um, politics. It definitely seems to me in the last decade that the AKP has gone from being the party that emphasized the economy and bread and butter issues, and it was the opposition that was sort of constantly trying to polarize on sort of protecting Turkey's secular identity, and concerned about the political Islam in Turkey. But you know, it does seem that there's been a shift towards this kind of culture war and identitarian politics. Can you talk a little bit about like how that works in Turkey? What is this culture war that's taking place in Turkey, and how is Erdogan using it? And really, when did he start using it, and why? And what is the context behind it? Because it is something you've written about before.
yeah, yeah. I mean, he's been using it all his life. I mean, so his origins are from the Turkish far right. When you talk about the Turkish far right, I think I usually refer to İlker Aytürk's work on this, who's a historian, and his definition of the far right is that during the sort of Kemalist sort of period, there were some right wing ideologues who dissented to Mustafa Kemal's overall project and his Republican vision, right? And those were pan Turkists, and there were, of course, Islamists, right? And those two traditions have continued, right? And Erdogan represents the sort of Islamist strand, but he has been able to uh, take under his wing the Turkish the pan Turkish strand as well, right? So um, that's really the far right, and for the far right, right, the important thing uh, Atatürk's argument is that for the center right, it was always economic development comes first, right, and identity politics comes second, right. So when you think of figures like Turgut Özal or Süleyman Demirel, that's always been the case. These guys were usually engineers by training. They were very sort of technical in their thinking, right, and they were very much about you know get, securing grants, doing big development projects. It wasn't really thought to be appropriate to dwell too much on the identitarian issue.
Right.
On the far right, um, the idea has always been, and this is a very strong idea in Erdogan, is that you need to get the identity right first. Once you get identity issues right, everything else flows from there. Because once somebody truly loves their country, he thinks, right, then they will also work. They will do whatever is necessary, right? Um, so it's a cart and horse sort of problem for these guys. So for Erdogan, when you go back, watch his very early speeches, his and read the people he read as a kid, as a young man. That's really the always the message, right? And that's how he has conducted politics. Really, he's always put the identity thing first, um, and then policy flows from there.
Well, does that account for his flexibility then? Because, as he focuses on the identity issues in terms of his economic program, he's being able to kind of zigzag between different sort of modes of economic policy, um, without without having any kind of fixed commitment.
Yeah, I think so. I think he has a long term vision for what he wants for the country, where he wants to take things, right? And if he needs to have some detours along the way,
Hmm.
he's fine with that. He is patient enough to do this.
Well,
I think
what's his vision?
his vision, first and foremost, is I think first and foremost, it is Turkey um, away from this what I call aspirational Occidentalism. This a cultural sort of at the so at the highest levels of Kemalist Turkey, the cultural project was to resemble the West, right? It was also pretty identitarian, was resemble the West, right? In order to be accepted in the West, and then sort of a trickle down cultural transformation. That's why you had all this sartorial reform and all that. So uh, his project is, I think, no question, to reverse that. First of all, to at the highest level, it's also a very cultural project, right? At the highest level, to be sort of the way he puts it is national, right? To be distinct from the West. That distinction is very important, right? And that doesn't always mean that you don't take on Western things. It just means that you maintain distinctiveness. So one example is uh, one person that was influential in the Erdogan generation was Kadir Masudoğlu, right? This sort of quack historian who wrote some influential books and speeches, but he was also known for wearing a fez, for example, right? And he wore this fez, and he explained it to people. The way he said, "Listen," he said, "I'm aware that most of my attire is Western, right? You don't have to explain this to me. The fez uh, is actually also a fairly recent thing. If you look at it historically, there were turbans, there were different sort of
It itself is a symbol of modernization.
it's a symbol of modernization, but he said it makes us different from the Gilbert, the infidel, right? And that's why that's this is the symbol of sort of holding on to that, holding on to distinction, right? And at the highest level, I think Erdogan's project is about restoring distinction and distinctiveness. Uh, the country's distinctiveness, and thereby the country's sort of exceptionalism, right? Because once you have that, you are exceptional. You are this sort of it is kind of comparable, I think, to American exceptionalism in the sense that you are this unique historical force that's supposed to expand across the map.
Yeah, so it's almost like a civilizational mission, and it's not a complete rejection of cooperation with the West on a transactional uh, uh, basis. It's not like ideologically opposed to the West in and of itself, but it seeks to be kind of a civilizational counterpart. That Turkey is a civilizational nation, right? Like in a similar way to other post-imperial nationalisms like Russia, where Russian nationalism is civilizational. It's like Russia's counterpart isn't Poland. Russia's counterpart is the Anglo-Saxon world, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, Turkey is not like a part of one of the European nations. It is a civilizational nation that straddles, between this between these two, for want of a better word, Asiatic orientations, alternative orientations, the pan-Turkic and the pan-Islamist.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I agree with you. In that it is very civilizational, and the way they sometimes put it is sort of authentic states or national states. Uh, but yeah, everybody's got different names for it. But it is a civilizational endeavor, and that is not to make it into some grand sort of intellectual or design thing at all. It is, I think, it's a project of revenge. I think it is reactionary, fundamentally reactionary to what it perceives to happen in the West. In that sense, I think the Russians as well are fundamentally Occidentalist in the way they peg everything, every sort of event, to what's happening in the West and how they're either replicating or countering uh, Western practices.
So, how does this bode for Erdogan's position going forward? We've seen this first round of voting, and it feels to me after the first round of voting, the opposition has kind of completely lost any momentum, and the main area of sort of political combat is, the opposition running further and further to the right on sort of issues of immigration and national identity and things like this. So, what do you think? I don't, nobody likes to predict anything, but what are your thoughts on the current situation and the political balance at Turkey after this first round of voting?
Yeah. And I'll say what I think both sides are sort of doing and thinking about. So I think the way that the Erdogan side of things is thinking about things right now is they're happy with the results. Right?
Hmm.
They're happy that they were able to hold on to pretty much almost everything they had. Um, and what they want to do, I think, they want to use this two-round system, the runoff, to their advantage. Because what they've always wanted was a supermajority. Right? They're not really happy with sort of 50% of the country supporting them and 50% of the country increasingly hating them more and more. They want to grow. And the way I think they're thinking about it was, okay, in the first round, we fractured them. In the second round, we completely sort of shatter the opposition. And the way they can do that is in the first round, after the first round, if the opposition is demoralized, they might not show up to vote, or nobody wants to vote for a loser, right? So people might actually switch to Erdogan, and then I think they're going for like 55 plus. I could see Erdogan telling people, okay, this is what we're going for. Do whatever is necessary to get there. So that's their game plan, I think. And on the opposition side, um, what people realized was, okay, we've underestimated nationalism. We've underestimated the extent to which people care about this, because the opposition's arguments uh, were, I think, A, we are better at managing the economy. B, we are not authoritarians, and this guy's an authoritarian. And I think, especially B, the authoritarian message, I don't think people care very much. People want authority. They don't really care about whether or not the leader of the country adheres to uh, the rule of law or not. I think that's um, the voter base didn't really care about that. So the only place the opposition cannot flank Erdogan on the right is immigration, because Erdogan has very clearly said that this is the only place where Erdogan's interests sort of collide. He has very clearly said that he is he is interested in maintaining Turkey's stance on immigration. There's really, I think, two reasons for this. I mean, people talk about it being a moral imperative for Erdogan and everything, but if he was such a moral person, there's many things he wouldn't have done. Okay, uh, probably not all that moral of a decision. It's two reasons really. It's an influx of cheap labor, right, and this that works with the economic system they've set up.
Yes, especially construction and these big mega projects, they require lots of cheap labor. And the irony is, Erdogan's early successes in the economy have dried up that pool of cheap labor to a certain degree, so the Syrians can fill that gap.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. They're sort of going into a semi Gulf model of things. And second, in the long term, if these people get citizenship, uh, it would actually work uh, towards Erdogan's sort of cultural vision of the country, of it being much more conservative, much more Islamist, and much more Islamic.
So, I mean, Turkey has a long history of demographic and ethnic engineering. So, do you see this perhaps then as part of Erdogan's vision then of culturally re-engineering the country to with a little bit more of a Middle Eastern flavor as opposed to being too Western orientated? It's
Yeah, these guys have this sort of biopolitical agenda. That is true. And they're not going to talk about this openly because they know it's a very sensitive issue to the public, and that the public would not want this. But yeah, um, I think these guys would have that kind of agenda, definitely.
So, what about the opposition? We talk about the opposition, but one of the things that's always struck me and why I was perhaps a bit skeptical about the Kılıçdaroğlu wave was that the opposition in Turkey is extremely ideologically incoherent, and the opposition voting bloc in general, has nothing beyond a particular hostility to Erdogan to keep it in to keep it together. So consequently, you know, how successful can they be? Because how much of a coherent vision can they offer to the country? Uh, you know, because at the end of the day, Erdogan, you know what you get with Erdogan,
Yeah,
but what are these guys offering? You have former, hard right, you know, nationalists. You have l- sort of liberal Islamists from the early period of the AKP's administration. You have the the spiritual successor party to Mustafa Kemal Atatürk's party. So, like what kind of unity can you have, even amongst this? Not to mention, the 10% that vote for the socialist or the Kurdish political parties. Like, how can these opposition groups really, truly mount some kind of serious, challenge to Erdogan in the first place, because they just can't conjure up a vision.
yeah. There's really no. So the opposition is the main opposition in the country. The most significant one is within the opposition. The right left polarization within the opposition. Right?
Mhm.
You have the left wing Kurds and you have E Party as the poles, right? And then you had the relatively centrist CHP in the middle, and then you had very small Islamist parties to dilute the Kemalism of the CHP to make it a little uh, less Kemalist, to soften it up and make it a little more progressive, right? That was the vision. And now, actually, today, Ümit Özdağ, the far right leader of Zafer Party, so the party that's sort of a single party anti-immigration platform.
He's basically, for those who want a comparison, he is like the Nigel Farage of Turkey. He's like a one-man discourse Overton window puller in kind of guy.
But Nigel Farage, I think he had a finance background, right?
Yeah.
I mean, Ümit Özdağ is much more in line with like intelligence and military, and you know, so he has a sort of network within the police. He's a very classic ülkücü type. The very very well, people who know Turkey will know of sort of Turkish being the man behind the scene. That's that sort of thing. That's the way he runs. Anyways, he came out in favor of Kılıçdaroğlu today. Made a brief speech saying that Kılıçdaroğlu is the sort of the last hope for the ülkücü. So now it's not even the polarization isn't even HDP Party. It's left Kurds and basically a pan-Turkic fascist on different sides of the spectrum. So and I don't know. There's speculation that Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu might give him the Ministry of Interior. Right?
Oh my goodness, that
Which
would be.
Which would be.
It's like, why even bother having the election?
Yeah.
And for those who don't know, the Ministry of Interior in Turkey, as you might guess, has quite extensive powers to do all kinds of things to you.
It'd be You have incredible. It's the biggest and most influential ministry. You'd have powers over the police, the gendarmerie, pretty much all sort of ID systems. It's huge, right? So somebody like that having that much power in that kind of a government, that would be insane. But yep. So that's what happened today. So the collective pool of the opposition. A friend of mine was saying, well, the temperature in the pool has now changed. So it's, I think one way of thinking of it is the sort of collective chemistry of the opposition has significantly changed now with Ümit Özdağ's endorsement. If this had happened several weeks before the election, well, the opposition coalition would probably have broken down in some way, right? They wouldn't have been able to sustain this. They're only able to sustain this now because the alternative is defeat to Erdogan, and nobody wants that. So they're sort of muddling through it.
They've all tied themselves to the sinking ship now, so that they can't get off.
Yeah. So whatever way Kılıçdaroğlu finds to fix the ship, they're sort of okay with for now, because it's better than the alternative. But no, I don't think any of them are going to like this. It's probably going to be. So Ümit Özdağ probably does bring a few points to Kılıçdaroğlu, right? But I think Kılıçdaroğlu's chances are still very low. But it is significant in some ways. So we'll see what happens.
Well, especially as you said earlier, if the election is so finely balanced, a couple of million votes hit this way or that way could make all the difference. And also having, let's just say, a very effective activist base around you, as Umut Özdağ has, um, also probably helps to a certain degree. But yeah, I mean, it does certainly seem that the chances of the opposition winning have significantly uh, deteriorated, and I think people are banking on an Erdogan victory. So, what I wanted to follow up with then is, what is the scenario for this second round? How do you think it's going to turn out? And if, as we suspect, Erdogan does win, you know, will he quote unquote moderate, or are we going to see a new round of polarization? You know, what do you think? What direction is Turkey going in at the moment?
Um, so yeah, Erdogan will probably win. The question will be by how much. So if the opposition at this point can avert that sort of supermajority, or Erdogan getting closer to that supermajority,
Mm-hmm.
if Erdogan's below like 54, 53, I think that's a decent outcome for the opposition. And then the next stop for the country will be balance of payments crisis, I believe, and then some sort of economic implosion, um, capital controls, things that the country hasn't gone through before, or well, hasn't gone through in a long time. So
So,
it'll test Erdogan's system. Yeah.
what are the dimensions of the economic crisis that's coming to Turkey? We talk about economic crisis a lot, but what are the specifics of how this is manifesting in Turkey and where it's heading? I think the main thing, if anyone knows anything, is that the inflation is extremely
Yes.
high, and it's wiping out people's savings. Making it hard, especially for salaried people, to keep up with the cost of living. Um, but what are the dimensions of this crisis? What's driving this crisis, and how do you think it's going to look if there's a economic crisis coming to Turkey?
Yeah, it'll be, I mean, inflation driven, I guess. In the cities, it's felt a lot more. I mean, there's this rapid, very brutal Londonization of Istanbul, where a lot of foreign money is coming in and buying up real estate left and right, so that it inflates housing prices. Um, Also, rich people within the country, perhaps for the most part, rich people within the country are buying up a lot of real estate. Everybody who can is because prices are inflating. So
So
people
that
are
so there
sorry.
are there are people making good money out of this crisis, and
Oh
I'm
yeah,
including people with connections to the government, because the government is so heavily implicated in real estate.
yeah, yeah. If you're in the real estate business, if you're running factories and things, um, if you have just good connections with the government, the way people talk about it sometimes is really mind-boggling. It's like, oh, somebody called me and said they've got 20 apartments over there, so I bought them up and you know, um, I sold them a year later or something like that. Just in a matter of fact way. The people who are in the real estate market and who are getting rich are getting incredibly wealthy. But yeah, for the vast majority of people, they're going to be, if they live in the big cities, they're going to be priced out of their homes. It used to be, for example, that like if you were a doctor or a police officer, um, and you needed to be positioned, like you always wanted to be sent to a big city. You wanted to be sent to Istanbul. You wanted to be sent to Ankara. You wanted
Right.
to be sent, to these. Now it's the reverse. People want to be sent to like some small town in like, I don't know, Denizli or Urfa or someplace where they can actually afford rent, and where they can sent their kids to some sort of private school because the public schools are pretty awful. Um, so yeah, this is that's going to accelerate, it seems. And then just financial flows are going to be much more difficult to conduct because people used to buy gold, people used to buy foreign exchange. It's an incredibly dollarized economy, and that's going to be much more difficult. Already, I mean, just talked to somebody today who wanted to withdraw 1,000 euros from her account, from her bank account, and the bank said, "No, we probably can't do that. There's no rule against it, but the bank's not supposed to do it, so they don't."
Right. So it's pretty severe then for people.
Yeah.
And it's gonna get worse after the election. I mean, the currency is already falling at the moment. I suspect if Erdogan wins, though, it'll slowly, at least slow down a little bit. I think.
Most people, I think people suspect the opposite, that
Mm.
once he wins, that the dollar, well, the lira is going to depreciate more.
Oh wow! So that's what people are thinking is going to happen. That's It's pretty concerning. Concerning for people in Turkey, but so this is going to be a new test for these networks that Erdogan has, his powers built on, and perhaps you can elaborate a little bit, as we head into the end about those networks, because they really do tell us something, kind of important about politics, as well, because you know Erdogan's strength in many ways is because he has a depth in civil society. Like there's all these networks, these institutions connected with his political party, which aren't just like get out the vote machines like you might see in America, but there are actual social, political, and economic uh, networks that have mobilized people who had been hitherto kind of excluded or at least marginalized in the Turkish political sort of system.
Yeah, so there's different dimensions to this. I mean, Erdogan really has his roots in the outskirts of the major cities, because there was a lot of migration to the cities in the last couple of generations in Turkey. The vast majority of the country actually moved places from rural to urban very quickly. So Erdogan's sort of formative experience was in sort of the outskirts of Istanbul, working with working class people to set up networks and to sort of take care of people, and yeah, have that political slash economic network building, right? And then that extended to the countryside more and more. There is that experience, but there is also a more sort of incisive experience, and that's the experience of the sort of Jamaat networks, right? And those are sort of religious orders that are pretty esoteric most of the time. They have these odd beliefs. They are centered around a sheikh or some sort of charismatic religious leader, right? And around that, these networks can quite often be very powerful. So the most powerful was the Gulen network, and the Gulen network was this sort of it spread very quickly, starting in the well, especially in the 90s and 2000s. But this was an Islamist network within the sort of bureaucracy and within the private sector, that most of it was sort of visible. Most of it you knew who these people were, right? A business was a Gülenist business or not. A newspaper was a Gülenist newspaper or not. But some of the sort of supporters of the Gülen movement were undercover. Right? They were sort of kind of sleeper agents within official bureaucracies, right? And that's how the Erdogan sort of movement was able to progress politically and economically so aggressively. and then Erdogan had a falling out with the Gulen movement, and started purging them. Um, but what happened next was that he started to replace, Erdogan's network started to replace a lot of the Gülenist networks, right? So other Jamaats, so other religious orders, sort of went in and took the place of the Gülen movement, and sometimes Erdogan's sort of Erdogan's family NGOs also took that role as well. So what ended up happening is that we now have like these religious orders in the country that often have sort of a commanding presence in whole swaths of the country. The healthcare sector, for example, is strongly dominated by this religious order from Adıyaman, for example. Um, you know, the, the police will have different sort of presences of different networks. So that kind of thing is spread across, I think, the whole country, and it's Erdogan's sort of system of governance. It's his way of governing the country.
So it's kind of like a two-layered. It's a two-layered. Let's say, yeah, it's a two-layered kind of political apparatus that lies outside of the control of the state, the formal state. That is this sort of civil society complex of, you know, above the board institutions or businesses that are affiliated with, the government or with Erdogan, and then these traditional networks of religious orders that have kind of been co-opted into the Erdogan system as well. So he kind of cobbles together these two sort of aspects of extra state power and organization, and this is a national network as well, one that sort of spreads across the country and brings a kind of elite together, a sort of middle management elite together across the country.
Yeah, and if you're a teacher or hospital manager or something like that, and you're not really a member of any of these networks, you can still make a living. You can still sort of make your way through, but you'll find that other people will have a leg up in a way that you just don't. You outwork them, but they somehow get the promotion and stuff. And then once you join those networks, a whole new sort of world opens up to you. You can all of a sudden you're upwardly mobile. You can, if you need something like you need to be positioned in some other job, or your spouse needs something, you can sort of make your way through the bureaucracy. You'll have people to help you along.
It's fantastic. It's really it always makes me giggle. It's like Erdogan has sort of stolen Turkey to give it to half of Turkey so that they will love him forever.
That's a good way of putting it. Yeah, that's pretty
He's
tragic. Yeah.
but it's a remarkably robust system. I mean, especially on the economic issue, and this is something I've been thinking about a lot. It's not like the opposition, their economic solutions to the bad the management of the Turkish economy. If they do what orthodox economics tells them to do, that's going to cause a lot of economic pain as well in Turkey.
Yes. Yeah.
You raise it, when people talk about raising interest rates, what you mean is throwing people out of work, right?
Yeah.
And you were talking at the outset about the fact that there may be a crisis in Turkey, but people have work, and work gives people dignity and a stake in society, right? It is, the right to work is like a core liberal political, demand. So people have that so even though they're kind of in an economic crisis, them having work is meaningful. Like they're doing something, they feel they're producing, they feel they have a stake, they have a salary. They're not sitting at home, mulling over like how I'm going to go out protest against the government, because they've got things to do. And the opposition's solution to this in the economic realm is like, well, we'll raise interest rates because that's what international capital says. And Erdogan can just go like hammer him and say, A, that's going to throw people out of work, and B, you're a slime dog trader who's going to capitulate to finance capital, which is kind of true.
Yeah, and I mean the left opposition was saying this. Listen, it's not about who the candidate is; it's about what he actually says. If you can actually tell people, listen, nobody's able to buy their own homes anymore. Everybody has to rent because we're priced out of all these buildings. So why not explain to people that you're going to cap that somehow? That you know you're going to put a tax on having owning multiple homes, right? Um, or explaining to people how you're actually going to provide jobs. That sort of thing is important to you, right? Instead of basically saying, I have Babajan here, who you know international markets trust, and then I'll set him loose on the economy, and then it'll be like the 2000s all over again. I guess. I mean, we've seen that wasn't convincing. I thought that Kılıçdaroğlu should have campaigned a lot more on the economic issues, and he chose the identitarian ground more than I thought he would in some things.
Yeah, and especially with the earthquake. I mean, they did as in a sense, they did better than they've done before, but it just, wasn't really enough for them to shake Erdogan, who at the end of the day is a guy with a vision. You might not like it, but it is a vision.
To build it. I mean, on the earthquake, actually, I thought Kılıçdaroğlu. I mean,
He did okay on that, I think.
yeah, his point was, listen, it's a constitutional right to own a home and to have a decent place to live. It's in the Constitution, which means that I'm not going to ask anybody to pay for the reconstruction. Like, because Erdogan's model has people paying for it in a sort of long time horizon, but nevertheless, people have to pay for it. Individuals have to pay for their own sort of destructed homes. Whereas in Kılıçdaroğlu's thing, it was a constitutional right. The state was going to assume the costs.
But they
Yeah,
can never really. I mean, they can't. That's another problem with the opposition is they can't, because their only coherence is opposition to Erdogan. They can't even articulate a kind of like economic program, because you have sort of neoliberal types and social democrats all like uh, operating in the same sort of waters.
I think so. There's criticism now. The election isn't over yet. I think there'll be more once it is. There's criticism from two sides basically.
Mm-hmm.
A, you could have been much more centrist and neoliberal and said, listen, this is Ekrem İmamoğlu. He's going to, you know, he's going to work with the Babajans and the sort of liberal economists to restore some sort of 2000s system.
Paradise. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And then, that could have actually worked. Electorally, it could have worked, right? Or you could have had, this is a radical new leader X. Could have been Kılıçdaroğlu, could have been somebody else. At that point, it doesn't really matter. He is a radical. Um, he will actually. He's believes that the state should provide much more than it previously did. He'll restore a social state. Um, he'll restore society basically, and then run on that sort of platform. That could have worked as well. I think that was higher risk, right? But if you're going that path, you should just commit to that fully, rather than sort of having this weird in between thing.
Being wishy-washy.
Yeah, that people didn't understand.
Well, as they say, it is what it is. I mean, we'll see. We'll see what happens very soon, and definitely more stormy times ahead for Turkey. But hopefully, things will look up in the future. I always hold out the prospect that things will be nicer for people in Turkey, and I hope the economic crisis eases off, because it really takes a toll on like everybody across society. It's like a very heavy toll on people.
It really does. Yeah. In the long term, things. I am optimistic for the long term, but we're not there yet, I think.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Selim. And I want to, tell people. I'll put it in the description. Check out Selim's uh, Substack, the cultural camp. Good terminology for the for Turkish politics. And I want to thank you once again for joining us here on TIR. And as we say, we are out.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
Oops.
No, I think.